The passport they tore apart. I had spent 12 years proving that discipline could outrun disappointment. Yet everything my family believed about me fit inside one lie. According to them, I was selfish. The irony almost made me smile. 36 hours before my scheduled flight to London, I walked into my parents' kitchen carrying a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The digital clock above the microwave read 7:24 a.m. Sunlight poured through the blinds in thin golden stripes, making the room feel strangely peaceful. Until I looked at the table. Small blue paper fragments covered the wood like confetti after a celebration nobody should have enjoyed. My passport. For one suspended heartbeat, I simply stared. My father sat with his elbows resting comfortably on the table, feeding another page into a paper shredder as though he were clearing old utility bills. The machine hummed steadily before swallowing the last piece. He never looked guilty. He looked satisfied. "You aren't going anywhere," he said without raising his voice. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of burned paper from the overheated shredder. My stomach tightened, but my face stayed still. "I see," I answered quietly. My mother folded her hands together.
"You'll thank us someday," she said.
Families stay together. Careers come and go. Across the room, my younger brother leaned against the refrigerator, scrolling through his phone with the kind of smile that always appeared when someone else paid the price for his comfort. He finally looked up. "So, London's cancelled?" He laughed softly. I didn't. What none of them mentioned was that nearly half the mortgage payment had quietly come from my account every month. The electric bill, the insurance premiums, my father's business loan when cash flow tightened. I had never kept score. Apparently they had. My father folded his arms. "No daughter of mine leaves this family chasing strangers across the ocean." "They aren't strangers," I replied. "They're my employer. They're using you." "No," I said. "They're paying me." Silence settled over the room. Heavy, cold, calculated. I had accepted an offer worth $248,750 per year to become an executive crisis management director for an international consulting firm headquartered in London. Years of overnight projects, impossible deadlines, and quiet sacrifices had finally become something tangible. My family never celebrated. They questioned. They minimized. They compared. Being the darker-skinned daughter had always come with invisible conditions. I was expected to achieve without attracting attention, earn without becoming independent, and succeed without making anyone uncomfortable. My brother never carried those expectations. He carried excuses. My mother sighed dramatically. "Money isn't everything." "No," I agreed. "Respect is." She looked away. That answer landed exactly where I intended. My father pushed his chair back. "You'll stay here. You'll help your family." End of discussion. It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. At least that's what they believed. Because while they celebrated destroying one document, they had absolutely no idea they hadn't destroyed my opportunity. Months earlier, the company had insisted on an unusually detailed relocation agreement. Confidentiality clauses, executive protection provisions, international travel contingencies. I remembered asking why everything seemed so extensive. The company's attorney had smiled. "We prepare for worst-case scenarios before they happen." At the time, I assumed she meant canceled flights or visa delays. Now I wondered if she had seen situations far stranger than mine. I reached into my bag and calmly picked up my laptop. My brother frowned. "That's it?" I looked at him. "What exactly were you hoping for?"
"For you to freak out."
"I don't give people that kind of power." His smile disappeared.
"Good."
My father mistook my composure for defeat. I knew you'd come to your senses. I simply nodded. Sometimes silence revealed more than arguments ever could. Sometimes people confessed their intentions because they believed the battle was already over. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that executive contracts often contained obligations extending far beyond salary. They also didn't know that failing to report for relocation under suspicious circumstances triggered mandatory corporate outreach. I walked upstairs without another word. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door gently behind me. Only then did I allow myself one slow breath. Not panic, not anger, calculation. I opened my email and reread the relocation packet one more time. My pulse slowed. There it was, exactly where I remembered. I had barely reached the final page when my phone vibrated across the desk. The screen displayed a number beginning with 44. London was calling. Chapter 2. The family they wanted me to keep funding the phone call from London ended with more reassurance than I expected, but it left me sitting in complete silence. I rested my hands on my desk and watched the morning sunlight crawl across the hardwood floor. Downstairs, I could hear my parents talking as though they had solved a problem instead of creating one. My brother laughed at something on television, completely unaware that the person who had quietly kept his life comfortable had finally stopped pretending everything was fair. Their voices carried through the vents. Comfortable.
Carefree.
Victorious. They thought they were winning. What they didn't know was that my career had never depended on a single document. It had been built on years of discipline that no shredder could destroy. As I waited for the next instructions from London, memories surfaced one after another. Growing up, I learned early that achievement earned me responsibility, not celebration. Whenever I brought home perfect grades, my father nodded once before asking me to help my brother with his homework. Whenever my brother barely passed a class, my parents celebrated with dinner at his favorite restaurant. I received expectations. He received applause. The difference became even more obvious as we grew older. Family friends constantly praised my brother's confidence while describing me as dependable. Dependable sounded like a compliment. In reality, it meant available. Available to solve problems. Available to pay bills. Available to sacrifice. Being the darker-skinned daughter only made those expectations heavier. Relatives complimented my intelligence before reminding me not to intimidate people. They admired my work ethic while suggesting women who focused too much on careers often ended up alone. My brother never heard those warnings. He only heard encouragement. When I earned my first management promotion, my mother smiled politely before whispering, "Just don't forget who needs you." She never asked whether I needed anyone. Years later, after becoming one of the youngest crisis management consultants in my firm, my salary increased dramatically. I never announced the number. I simply started helping. The mortgage payment came due. I transferred money. The electricity bill arrived. I handled it. Unexpected medical expenses appeared. I covered them without mentioning repayment. Month after month, nearly half the household expenses quietly left my account.
No contracts. No receipts. No recognition.
My father accepted every transfer without hesitation. Then he lectured me about financial responsibility. The contradiction never seemed to bother him. Appearances mattered more. He drove a luxury SUV that still impressed neighbors despite being financed beyond reason. He wore expensive watches purchased with borrowed money. Every Sunday, he spoke proudly about protecting the family's reputation. Behind closed doors, collection notices arrived with uncomfortable frequency. I accidentally discovered the truth one afternoon while organizing insurance documents for him. Outstanding balances, business loans, refinance debt, past due notices. His company looked successful from the outside. Inside, it was surviving on borrowed time. He never realized I knew. I never confronted him, not because I was afraid, because I understood something he didn't. People buried in debt often mistake silence for ignorance. Meanwhile, my mother perfected another strategy.
Guilt.
Whenever I questioned why my contributions were expected while my brother remained financially untouched, she softened her voice and reached for emotion instead of logic. Families don't keep score. I wasn't keeping score, I replied once. I was noticing patterns. Her smile disappeared immediately. You've changed.
No, y answered quietly.
I've started paying attention. She cried that evening, not because I hurt her, because accountability had entered the conversation. The next morning, everything returned to normal, at least on the surface. Professionally, my life couldn't have looked more different. While my family believed I worked an ordinary consulting job, I spent years resolving multi-million-dollar corporate emergencies across 3 continents. I negotiated labor disputes before they became strikes. I coordinated executive responses during cyber attacks. I stabilized acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars before investors noticed the underlying risks. Confidentiality agreements prevented me from discussing clients. My silence allowed my family to underestimate me. That became my greatest advantage. International executives knew my name. My relatives barely understood my job title. The contrast almost amused me. Almost. Back downstairs, my brother knocked lightly against my bedroom door before walking in without waiting. So he asked casually, "Guess you're staying after all?" "For now." He leaned against the doorway. "Honestly, London's overrated." I smiled faintly. "You've never been." "I've seen videos." His confidence rested on assumptions. Mine rested on preparation. There was a difference. He left moments later, convinced he had won another invisible competition. I returned to my laptop and opened the relocation agreement again. Every clause reflected careful planning. Executive relocation, security procedures, travel contingencies, emergency communication protocols. Large international companies anticipated disruptions because disruption was expensive. Replacing someone with my specialization would cost far more than protecting the investment they had already made. At exactly 2:17 p.m., my phone rang again. The same London area code appeared across the screen. I answered immediately. "This is Naomi." The familiar voice sounded calm. "Ms. Brooks, we've reviewed everything you shared." I waited. "We don't believe your absence is voluntary." A slow breath escaped my lungs. "Thank you. Our leadership team agrees your situation requires immediate attention." The representative paused just long enough for my heartbeat to quicken. "Someone from the company is already on the way to your hometown." Everything downstairs suddenly felt much closer. Chapter 3. The man who thought my career was cute. The company representative arrived in my hometown less than 24 hours after our second phone call. I expected someone from human resources. Instead, a black luxury sedan stopped in front of my parents' house precisely at 10:08 a.m. The driver stepped out first, followed by a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and polished brown shoes that had probably never touched a dusty driveway before. He carried himself like someone accustomed to entering boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made before lunch. I walked outside before anyone else could answer the door. He offered a practiced smile. "Naomi Brooks?" "Yes." He extended his hand. Ethan Caldwell. I'm the senior acquisition consultant overseeing your executive transition. His handshake was firm, deliberate, almost theatrical. I appreciate you coming. Our company doesn't abandon executive appointments without understanding the facts. That sentence earned my respect, at least for the moment. Behind us, my father opened the front door. So, you're the people trying to steal my daughter. Ethan turned politely. We're simply here to understand why one of our incoming executives suddenly stopped responding. I already answered that, my father replied. She decided to stay with her family. I remained silent. Sometimes silence was the strongest correction. Ethan glanced between us before looking back at me. Is that accurate?
No.
Only one word. Nothing more. He nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing else. We moved to a nearby coffee shop to speak privately. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the smell of roasted coffee filled the quiet room. Ethan opened a leather portfolio. I've reviewed your employment file.
So have I.
He smiled politely. I imagine this situation has been emotional. It has been educational. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I've learned who supports my future. For the first time, his smile looked forced. He asked about my passport, my travel documents, and the events inside my parents' home. I answered every question with precise details, including timestamps and names. Years in crisis management had trained me to separate emotion from evidence. Facts survived scrutiny. Feelings rarely did. He listened carefully while writing notes. Then his tone shifted. He said, leaning back, people occasionally panic after accepting overseas positions. I didn't panic. They sometimes exaggerate family conflicts because relocating feels overwhelming. I didn't exaggerate. I'm just considering every possibility.
So am I.
His smile returned, but it carried something sharper now. Your resume is certainly ambitious. I met his eyes. It was verified before I was hired.
I'm aware.
He stirred his coffee without looking at me. I've simply noticed younger executives occasionally present themselves more impressively than reality supports. The meaning was unmistakable. Women like me, Black women, especially confident Black women. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I had heard versions of it throughout my entire career. I folded my hands calmly. Every certification listed was earned. I'm sure. Every promotion was documented. I'm sure. Every client reference remains available. I'm sure. His confidence weakened with every answer. People expecting defensiveness rarely knew what to do with composure. He changed subjects. So, why crisis management? Because chaos tells the truth faster than comfort. That answer finally made him pause. For a brief moment, I saw curiosity replace superiority. Then it disappeared. When we finished our meeting, he offered another handshake. We'll continue reviewing everything. I expected nothing less. As he walked toward his car, I noticed him making an immediate phone call. His expression hardened. Whatever confidence he had shown inside the cafe seemed noticeably thinner. Something about this situation unsettled him. I couldn't yet explain why. That afternoon, I drove across town to visit the one person whose advice had never carried hidden conditions. My grandfather. Retired federal judge Charles Brooks lived in the same modest brick house where he had spent nearly 40 years. His front porch still smelled faintly of cedar after every rainfall. He welcomed me inside without unnecessary questions. You look tired, he said. I've been disappointed. There is a difference. I smiled softly. There is. We sat together in his study surrounded by shelves filled with legal journals, framed court photographs, and decades of handwritten notes. He remained silent for several moments. Then he opened a locked drawer. From inside, he removed a sealed manila envelope and a small encrypted flash drive. He placed both carefully on the desk between us. "I've been waiting to give you these." I looked at him.
What are they?
"The first is a legal file, and the second, insurance." I frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "You will." His calm voice carried the weight of someone who had watched arrogance destroy countless people from behind a courtroom bench. "I learned something many years ago," he continued.
What was that?
"The truth always defeats arrogance." He gently pushed the envelope closer, but only if it's presented at exactly the right moment. I hesitated before picking it up.
Does this involve me?
"It involves someone who believes rules exist for everyone except himself." "Ethan?" My grandfather didn't answer immediately. Judges rarely volunteered conclusions. They respected evidence too much. Instead, he simply nodded once. "I've spent months verifying information through entirely lawful channels." I stared at the flash drive resting in my palm. It suddenly felt heavier than its size should have allowed. "Whatever you do," he said quietly, "don't rush." "I won't." Arrogant people usually destroy themselves. He looked directly into my eyes. "You merely need to make sure everyone is watching." That evening I returned home and locked my bedroom door. Outside, my family laughed over dinner as though nothing important had changed. They had absolutely no idea another battle had already begun. I connected the encrypted flash drive to my laptop. After entering the password my grandfather had written inside the envelope, dozens of folders appeared across the screen.
Consulting invoices. Wire transfers.
Internal audit reports. Confidential email chains. The names repeated again and again. One appeared more than every other. Ethan Caldwell. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Professional instinct replaced surprise. The documents outlined millions of dollars in fraudulent consulting contracts hidden inside acquisition expenses. Then I opened the final folder. Everything connected to something far larger than simple corporate fraud. The conspiracy reached far beyond Ethan alone. Chapter 4. The night I stopped wanting their love, I drove back to my apartment just after sunset with my grandfather's flash drive resting inside my purse like a quiet promise. The streets looked ordinary. My life no longer did. Rain streaked across the windshield while the radio played softly in the background, but I barely heard the music. Every conversation from the past 2 days replayed inside my mind with uncomfortable clarity. My father's certainty, my mother's guilt, Ethan's polished arrogance. Each one believed they understood me. None of them did. I had barely stepped through my apartment door when my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I answered. "Are you finally coming home?" she asked without greeting me. "I am home." "You know what I mean." "I do." She sighed dramatically. "Your father is embarrassed. People keep asking why you missed your flight." "I didn't miss it. You refused it."
No, y replica calmly.
Someone else made that decision. Her silence lasted only a moment. "You always make everything sound so cold." "I've had practice." "You've changed since you started making good money." I slowly placed my keys onto the kitchen counter.
No.
"I changed when I realized my value depended on what I could provide." "That's unfair."
Is it?
She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the familiar weapon.
Guilt.
"We sacrificed everything to raise you." "I know. You owe this family."
I've spent years believing that. And now?
I looked around my quiet apartment. "And now I think I've already paid." She ended the call, without saying goodbye. 5 minutes later, my father called. I almost ignored it. Almost. "You embarrass this family," he said immediately. "I never intended to. You let outsiders question our decisions. They asked questions because something happened. You should have defended us." I closed my eyes. "I defended this family for years. You should have done it again." His words settled over me with unexpected calm. There was no anger left, only understanding. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted a resource. When that realization finally settled inside me, something broke. Not loudly, quietly. I walked into my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed years of disappointment to leave without resistance. The tears came slowly, not because my passport had been destroyed, not because my career had been delayed. I cried because I finally accepted a truth I had spent most of my life avoiding. I had been loved most when I was useful. Every promotion meant another expectation. Every raise meant another emergency. Every sacrifice became tomorrow's obligation. Nothing was ever enough. The apartment remained completely silent except for the rain tapping gently against the windows. I wiped my face once, then again. That was enough. Those became the last tears I ever shed asking people to become who they had repeatedly proven they were not. When I stood, I felt strangely lighter. The daughter searching for approval stayed behind in that bedroom. The strategist walked into my home office. I placed my grandfather's legal file beside my laptop and connected the encrypted flash drive once more. Multiple folders covered my screen. Corporate acquisition records, internal audit memorandums, vendor agreements, payment authorizations. Every document carried timestamps, signatures, and digital verification logs. Evidence. Not accusations. Evidence. Years in crisis management had taught me that emotions rarely changed outcomes. Documentation did. I opened Ethan Caldwell's consulting agreements first. Several contracts authorized unusually large payments to shell consulting firms with remarkably similar ownership structures. One transfer totaled $4,870,000. Another exceeded $2,130,000. Each approval appeared technically compliant. Each one concealed something beneath the surface. I opened the legal file my grandfather had prepared. Inside were carefully organized notes connecting those payments to acquisition projects involving the same international company that had hired me. Nothing had been stolen outright. Instead, invoices had been inflated. Advisory fees duplicated. Risk assessments billed multiple times through affiliated companies. Elegant fraud. The kind committed by people wearing expensive suits instead of masks. I leaned back and considered every possible outcome. Revenge tempted emotion. Justice required patience. There was a difference. Destroying reputations without evidence would make me no better than the people who had tried to destroy mine. Exposing documented facts allowed the truth to speak for itself. That became my strategy. I would not attack. I would reveal. My family believed they had trapped me inside this town. Ethan believed I lacked the experience to challenge him. They had absolutely no idea they were walking toward the same cliff from different directions. The next several hours passed methodically. I organized timelines, verified financial records, cross-referenced contract numbers, created chronological summaries supported by original documentation. Every conclusion pointed back to evidence rather than opinion. By 1:43 a.m., a clear picture had emerged. This wasn't simply corporate misconduct. It threatened investors, employees, pension funds, and innocent people who trusted executive leadership. That changed everything. This had become larger than my passport, larger than my family, larger than me. I opened my secure company email and drafted a confidential request addressed to the Executive Governance Committee. The subject line remained simple: confidential evidence requiring immediate board review. I attached nothing. Sensitive material deserved controlled handling. Instead, I requested a private meeting under executive confidentiality procedures. Within minutes, an automated acknowledgement confirmed receipt. A second message arrived shortly afterward. The board chair had approved my request. I opened the calendar invitation, selected the earliest available executive session, and entered one final detail:
Monday,
9 a.m. Then I pressed schedule. Chapter 5. They thought they controlled the story. Monday morning arrived with unusual calm. At exactly 6:45 a.m., I stood beside my apartment window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. The city outside moved with ordinary rhythm while my life quietly shifted beneath the surface. The confidential meeting request had already been accepted. The investigation was underway. Every document my grandfather entrusted to me now rested inside secure corporate servers instead of my laptop. No one outside that circle knew. That was exactly how it needed to remain. Silence had become my greatest advantage. Meanwhile, my family filled that silence with their own version of the truth. By lunchtime, 3 relatives had called me. Each conversation sounded almost identical. I heard you backed out of another big opportunity. Your father said you weren't ready. Your mother said London scared you. I never corrected them. I hope everyone is doing well, was all I said before ending each conversation. They mistook my restraint for shame. They had absolutely no idea my silence was preserving the integrity of an active corporate investigation. The less I said publicly, the stronger the evidence remained privately. Late that afternoon, I drove past my parents' neighborhood on my way home for meeting with company counsel. Their driveway overflowed with familiar vehicles. My aunt's SUV sat beside my cousin's pickup truck, and laughter drifted through the open windows. Another family gathering. Another opportunity to rewrite history. I kept driving. There was nothing inside that house I still needed. An hour later, my phone vibrated again. My mother. I answered after the second ring. "You embarrassed your father again," she said. "What happened?" "Your aunt asked why the company keeps calling the house. They're trying to locate an executive employee. You should tell them you've changed your mind." "I haven't. You've already lost that job." I glanced toward the confidential email confirmation still open on my laptop.
"No," y replica calmly.
"I really haven't." She sighed dramatically. "You've become impossible to talk to. I've become impossible to manipulate." The line went silent. Then she whispered, "Family should come first." I believed that for years.
And now?
Now I believe family should deserve first. She disconnected without another word. I placed the phone on my desk and returned to reviewing legal correspondence from the company's internal compliance division. The investigation had expanded faster than anyone expected. Corporate auditors compared vendor invoices against banking records. Digital forensic specialists reviewed email archives. Outside counsel analyzed acquisition contracts dating back 4 years. Every department worked independently. Every conclusion pointed toward the same individual, Ethan Caldwell. What began as suspicious consulting fees now revealed a pattern of deliberate financial deception. Invoices had been duplicated under different subsidiary names. Consulting expenses had been inflated beyond market value. Approval chains had been manipulated through carefully timed authorizations. The fraud looked sophisticated. It wasn't perfect, greed rarely was. The greatest damage hadn't been suffered by executives. It had fallen on people Ethan probably never considered. Junior consultants lost promotion opportunities after budget reductions. Administrative employees endured layoffs blamed on restructuring. Retirement contributions into employee pension plans were delayed, while unnecessary consulting invoices received immediate approval. Small vendors waited months for payment because company cash flow had quietly disappeared into fraudulent contracts. Numbers on spreadsheets represented real families, real mortgages, real college tuition, real lives. That realization strengthened my resolve. This stopped being personal. It became responsibility. 2 days later, Ethan requested another meeting. This time he chose an expensive steakhouse overlooking the river. Everything about the restaurant projected wealth. Crystal glasses, dark wood walls, soft piano music. He arrived wearing another tailored suit and an expensive watch that reflected the dining room lights each time he moved his wrist. He smiled confidently. "I'm glad you agreed to meet. I wanted clarity."
"So do I."
The waiter poured water before leaving us alone. Ethan leaned forward. "I've been hearing interesting rumors. I try not to build decisions on rumors." "Smart." He smiled again. "But people tell me you've been asking unusual questions." "I ask questions for a living." His expression hardened slightly. "I'd be careful where those questions lead."
"Why?"
"Corporate reputations are fragile. So are personal ones." His fingers tightened around the glass. "I'd hate to see someone with potential destroy her own career chasing misunderstandings." I held his gaze. "I only chase facts." He laughed softly. Lawsuits become very expensive." "They do. Especially when someone interferes with legitimate business relationships. I imagine fraudulent ones become even more expensive." His smile disappeared. For the first time since meeting him, I saw genuine concern. Only for a second. Then the polished executive returned. "I think you're overestimating your influence." "I've made no assumptions."
He stood.
"This conversation is over." I suspected it would end that way. He walked away without looking back. People who depended on intimidation usually retreated once intimidation stopped working. The following afternoon, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I answered automatically. "Naomi Brooks." Ethan's voice filled the line. "We need to clear something up."
"I'm listening."
"I've been thinking about our conversation."
"So have I."
"You don't understand how acquisitions work." "I understand documented transactions. They're complicated. They're traceable." His breathing grew heavier. "Sometimes invoices move through different entities because that's simply how business gets done." I remained silent. He continued talking. "Not every payment reflects exactly what it appears to be." Still I said nothing. He mistook my silence for uncertainty. "I've signed hundreds of consulting approvals. No one questions those details." Another pause. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "Those contracts were never meant to receive this level of scrutiny." I glanced toward my phone. The automatic call recording notification quietly confirmed the conversation had been preserved. Ethan had absolutely no idea he had just admitted far more than he intended. Chapter 6. The boardroom became a courtroom. Monday arrived with the kind of quiet confidence that only preparation could create. I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. The city outside my apartment still slept beneath a gray sky, while my mind replayed every document I had reviewed during the previous week. There was no uncertainty left. Every financial record had been verified. Every timeline had been checked twice. Every statement rested on evidence instead of emotion. That difference mattered. Truth never needed dramatic delivery. It only needed the right audience. I stood before my bedroom mirror at 6:40 a.m. and slipped into a tailored black suit with sharp lines and understated elegance. It wasn't the most expensive outfit I owned, but it represented everything I had become. It felt less like business attire and more like battle armor. I fastened one silver button on the jacket and looked at my reflection. For years, I had dressed to earn approval. Today, I dressed to honor myself. The leather portfolio resting beside my front door contained everything that mattered. My employment contract, the relocation agreement, the internal financial audit, certified copies of suspicious consulting invoices, the recorded phone conversation, my grandfather's encrypted flash drive. None of it relied on my opinion. Evidence never asked anyone to believe. It invited them to verify. By 8:37 a.m., I entered the headquarters of the international consulting firm. The lobby reflected polished marble floors, towering glass walls, and quiet confidence. Executives crossed the room carrying tablets instead of briefcases. Assistants moved with practiced efficiency. Security personnel greeted visitors without unnecessary conversation. Everything about the building communicated accountability. That made what Ethan had done even more astonishing. An assistant escorted me to the executive conference floor. Outside the boardroom, clusters of people spoke in measured voices. Senior executives, corporate attorneys, external auditors, institutional investors, several respected business journalists, community leaders invited to observe the company's governance announcement. Everyone expected a celebration introducing a new executive crisis management director. Very few realized they were about to witness something entirely different. Then I noticed my parents. My father wore his favorite charcoal suit, the one reserved for occasions when appearances mattered more than honesty. My mother stood beside him, wearing a confident smile that disappeared the instant our eyes met. My younger brother leaned casually against the wall, grinning as though he had already seen the ending. My father walked toward me. So you finally came to admit you failed. I came because I was invited. You should save yourself the embarrassment. I appreciate your concern. He shook his head. You've always been stubborn. I've always been prepared. He laughed quietly before turning back toward the entrance. He genuinely believed I was walking into my own humiliation. They had absolutely no idea. At exactly 8:58 a.m., Ethan Caldwell entered the hallway surrounded by two associates. His confidence filled the room before his voice did. He smiled as though nothing had changed. Naomi, he said warmly, I'm surprised you decided to show up. I keep my commitments. He adjusted his cufflinks. I hope today helps you understand how executive decisions are actually made. I'm looking forward to learning. He interpreted my calmness as uncertainty. That was his first mistake. Inside the boardroom, everyone took their assigned seats around a long walnut table. The atmosphere remained professional but unusually tense. The chairwoman welcomed everyone before outlining the morning agenda. She briefly mentioned executive appointments. Then she paused. Our first matter concerns governance and fiduciary responsibility. I noticed Ethan shift slightly in his chair. Only slightly. The chairwoman nodded toward me. Ms. Brooks, you requested this confidential session. I did. You may proceed. I stood without rushing. Every movement felt deliberate. Every breath remained steady. I placed my leather portfolio on the conference table and removed 4 neatly organized folders. One by one, without speaking, the employment contract, the independent audit summary, a certified transcript of the recorded phone call, the encrypted flash drive.
Then I sat down again.
Silence settled across the room. The chairwoman looked toward Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, before reviewing these materials, would you like to respond to the concerns previously submitted? He smiled confidently.
Certainly.
He stood. What you're about to hear stems from a misunderstanding created by an inexperienced employee who unfortunately overestimated both her qualifications and her understanding of international acquisitions. Several people glanced toward me. I remained silent. Ethan continued. Ms. Brooks accepted a position she later realized exceeded her capabilities. I folded my hands. He kept talking. After failing to relocate, she began creating elaborate accusations designed to protect her professional reputation. No response. His confidence grew stronger. I've supervised acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Still nothing.
My consulting agreements have always complied with company policy. One corporate attorney quietly opened the first audit folder. Ethan didn't notice. I've spent 15 years protecting shareholder value. An external auditor compared invoice numbers. Another executive inserted the flash drive into a secured company laptop. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of pages turning. Ethan mistook that silence for agreement. He smiled again. As for these alleged payment irregularities, anyone familiar with executive consulting understands invoices often move between affiliated entities. The lead auditor slowly raised his eyes. No, he said calmly, not like these. Ethan froze for the first time. Only for a second. Then he recovered. I believe those records are being misunderstood. The corporate attorney spoke next. The banking confirmations match the internal audit. Another executive added quietly, so do the approval logs. I remained seated. There was nothing I needed to argue. Evidence had already begun speaking. Ethan's polished confidence slowly transformed into impatience. This is ridiculous. Nobody answered.
He pointed toward me.
She's manipulating isolated transactions without understanding executive accounting. The chairwoman looked toward the technology director. Please play the submitted recording. The speakers activated. Ethan's own voice filled the boardroom. Not every payment reflects exactly what it appears to be. The recording continued. Those contracts were never meant to receive this level of scrutiny. Silence returned.
Different now. Heavy.
Irreversible. Ethan immediately leaned forward. That conversation lacks context. The general counsel calmly adjusted his glasses. What context would justify those statements? His answer never arrived. The lead forensic accountant projected transaction summaries onto the large screen.
Wire transfers.
Duplicate invoices. Related business entities. Approval timestamps. Everything aligned with the documents inside my portfolio. Every explanation Ethan attempted contradicted another verified record. His own words dismantled his credibility faster than anyone else could have. He interrupted himself, corrected himself, contradicted himself. Each sentence buried the previous one. I never interrupted. I barely spoke. I simply watched years of carefully constructed deception collapse beneath documented facts. My father looked toward me with growing confusion. My mother's confident expression disappeared completely. My brother stopped smiling. For the first time since destroying my passport, none of them understood what was happening. The chairwoman finally broke the silence. Ms. Brooks. Yes. Do you have anything further to add? I looked around the room before answering. Only this. Every face turned toward me. The truth doesn't become stronger because someone raises their voice. I glanced briefly toward Ethan. It becomes unavoidable when someone raises the evidence. Before anyone could respond, the boardroom doors opened. Several people wearing dark jackets stepped inside, displaying official credentials. Federal investigators had arrived. Chapter 7. The company came. Looking. The silence inside the boardroom changed the moment the federal investigators identified themselves. No one rushed toward the door. No one argued. Years of executive experience had taught everyone present that panic usually belonged to people who already knew they were guilty. I remained seated with my hands folded on the conference table. For the first time since my passport had been destroyed, I felt no pressure to defend myself. The truth had already done that. One investigator thanked the board for preserving the evidence and requested copies of the financial records, the internal audit, and the recorded phone conversation. The company's general counsel immediately confirmed that every document had already been secured through proper legal procedures. Everything moved with calm professionalism. That mattered. Justice built on procedure lasted longer than revenge built on emotion. Across the room, Ethan looked nothing like the polished consultant who had mocked my career only days earlier. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too large for the confidence he had lost. He tried speaking twice. Neither sentence reached the end. His own words had become stronger evidence than anything I could have accused him of. The chairwoman turned toward me after the investigators stepped aside. "Ms. Brooks, before we conclude today's meeting, the board has one remaining matter." I nodded. She offered a small, respectful smile. "Your appointment as Executive Crisis Management Director was never withdrawn." Several executives quietly agreed. "Our concern was never your qualifications. It was my safety," I answered. "Exactly." The chief executive leaned forward. "When communications stopped unexpectedly, our executive protection policy required us to determine whether your absence was voluntary." "It wasn't." "We know." He opened a folder bearing the company seal. "The destruction of your passport delayed your relocation." He paused briefly before continuing. "It never canceled your appointment." A weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying finally disappeared. Years of discipline. Months of preparation. Countless sacrifices. None of them had been erased by one act of cruelty. The chief executive continued. "Replacing someone with your crisis management experience would have cost this organization far more than protecting your transition." The room remained completely quiet. "We consider you too valuable to lose." Those words meant more than the salary ever had. For so long I had searched for acceptance inside a family that measured love by usefulness. Now I sat among professionals who measured value by integrity, preparation, and results. The difference changed everything. The company's relocation director entered the room carrying another portfolio. She smiled warmly. "We've already coordinated emergency travel documentation through the appropriate government channels." She placed several papers before me. "Your replacement passport has been expedited." She turned another page. "Private relocation accommodations have been arranged in London." Another page. "Temporary executive housing is reserved for 90 days." Another. "Executive security personnel will assist during your transition until we determine there is no remaining risk." I looked down at the documents. Everything had already been prepared. They had absolutely no idea that the company they mocked had contingency plans for situations my family couldn't even imagine. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside the building, journalists gathered near the entrance after learning that an internal corporate investigation had expanded into a federal matter. Company representatives refused to discuss confidential details. That restraint only intensified public curiosity. By evening, the story had spread through business circles across the city. Not the version my parents had invented, the real one. Friends who once congratulated my father for keeping his daughter close suddenly stopped calling. Business acquaintances quietly distanced themselves. Church members who had listened to my mother's version of events began asking uncomfortable questions she could no longer answer. The carefully polished image my parents had protected for years began collapsing almost overnight. Reputations built on appearances rarely survived documented truth. 2 days later, I returned to my parents' house one final time before leaving for London. The familiar driveway looked smaller than I remembered. The house felt quieter. My brother opened the front door without his usual confidence. He barely met my eyes.
No jokes. No smirks.
Just silence. Inside, my mother sat at the kitchen table where my passport had been destroyed. She looked exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Simply tired. She started to speak before lowering her eyes instead. My father walked into the room a few moments later. For the first time in my life, his shoulders seemed heavier than his voice. He looked at me for several long seconds. "I was wrong," he said quietly. I didn't answer. There was nothing either of us could gain by pretending those words erased what had happened. He took another slow breath. "I thought I was protecting this family. You were protecting control." He lowered his head. "I know." The room fell silent. The same kitchen. The same table. Only the truth had changed. He looked at me again, and the certainty that had defined him for decades was finally gone. In its place stood something I had never seen before. Humility. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Naomi." I waited. Is forgiveness still possible? Chapter 8. Some doors never reopened. The first morning I walked into my London office, I didn't think about revenge. I thought about distance. Not the thousands of miles between England and the house where I grew up, but the distance between the woman who once begged to be appreciated and the woman who no longer needed permission to succeed. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city as sunlight reflected across the glass towers surrounding our headquarters. People hurried through the streets below carrying briefcases, coffee cups, and plans that belonged entirely to them. For the first time in my life, every decision waiting for me belonged entirely to me as well. I placed my laptop on the desk, straightened the framed company welcome letter, and stood quietly for a moment. Peace felt unfamiliar. Then I realized why. I had spent years confusing peace with approval. They were never the same thing. The weeks that followed brought consequences I never had to create. I simply stopped protecting people who had spent years protecting lies. The investigation into Ethan Caldwell expanded far beyond the original consulting contracts. Independent auditors uncovered additional financial irregularities, while civil lawsuits from investors and vendors followed the criminal investigation already underway. Employees who had quietly lost promotions and retirement contributions because of fraudulent accounting finally learned the truth. Justice arrived slowly. Then, all at once, the company established a restitution program for affected employees, strengthened its internal compliance procedures, and promoted several talented junior consultants who had been overlooked during Ethan's influence. Watching innocent people regain opportunities mattered more than watching one dishonest executive lose his. That was the difference between justice and revenge. Back home, my family faced consequences that no courtroom could manufacture. My father's business relied almost entirely on reputation. Once clients learned that years of financial problems had been hidden beneath carefully crafted appearances, contracts quietly disappeared. No dramatic collapse followed. Only unanswered phone calls, canceled meetings, empty promises. Eventually, the image he valued more than honesty simply stopped convincing anyone. My mother experienced a different kind of loss. Relatives who had believed every story about my supposed selfishness slowly discovered the truth through public records, company statements, and conversations she could no longer control. Invitations became less frequent. Phone calls became shorter. The sympathy she once collected disappeared when people realized how often she had used guilt instead of love. She wasn't abandoned. She was finally seen clearly. My younger brother faced adulthood without the invisible support he had always assumed would remain available. For years, I had quietly paid bills before anyone noticed they existed. When those payments stopped, reality arrived with remarkable speed. Rent still came due. Utilities still required payment. Responsibility refused to wait for excuses. I never celebrated those changes. I simply refused to interrupt them. Forgiveness eventually found a place inside my heart, but reconciliation required something different. Trust. And trust, once deliberately broken, rarely returned in its original form. I answered occasional phone calls. I returned holiday messages. I wished my family well. What I never did was hand them the keys to my future again. Some doors can be repaired. Others should remain respectfully closed. Months later, I stood once more beside the same office window overlooking London's skyline. The city buzzed beneath me with endless possibility. Somewhere across the ocean, people who once believed they had decided my future were living with the realization that they had only delayed my departure. They had absolutely no idea that the greatest victory would never be my salary, my title, or the office behind me. The greatest victory was becoming someone whose peace could no longer be negotiated. If you're listening to my story today, I hope you remember this. Some people will only applaud your dreams when they believe those dreams still benefit them. Others will mistake your kindness for dependence and your silence for weakness. Let them.
Keep building anyway. Keep learning anyway.
Keep preparing anyway. One day, the truth will arrive without raising its voice, and the people who underestimated you will discover they were arguing with your present while you were already living in your future. The passport they tried to destroy was only paper. My purpose was never made of paper. It was built through discipline, integrity, and the quiet decision to keep moving forward when every reason to quit stood directly in front of me. The passport they destroyed only delayed my flight, because no one can shred the future that God, truth, and hard work have already stamped with your name.